Our next speaker is Director of Product Analytics at Indigo AG, where she helps build digital products that increase farm profitability via sustainable growing practices. And what have you done to save the world today? And before Indigo, she spent a decade leading data teams in early and mid-stage startups. And today we will hear about her perspective on happy data practitioners. Please welcome Caitlin Moorman.
All right, good morning. Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Moorman. Thanks for joining this morning. I'm super excited to go a little more esoteric and talk about some data team management frameworks and kind of ways to think about some of the challenges we all face that I've found helpful. So first, a little bit about me. I am currently Director of Product Analytics at Indigo Ag, which is a US-based agricultural tech company. And I've been leading data teams for 10 years. I'm also part of the leadership team of Locally Optimistic, which is a Slack community and blog for data leaders. So I spend a lot of time talking to other folks in the industry who are grappling with some of these questions around how to structure your team, how to lead your team to be as effective as possible. And today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the big picture of the kinds of work that your data team does and how we can balance sometimes competing needs. I believe there's a fundamental tension on modern data teams between two types of work, which I call proficiency-oriented and creativity-oriented work. And if you don't recognize and proactively manage that tension, it's easy to lean too far in one direction or another. It takes thoughtful leadership and an intentional team culture to give the individuals on your team the space and the skills to prioritize both kinds of work. But when you get it right, it can both make the team more effective within your organization, and it can make the individuals on your team dramatically happier. So let's start with a super high-level view of what those types of work are. The first is proficiency-oriented work. This is really about rigor. It's the work that makes data usable and useful to the organization. It's making sure your data arrives on time, that it's accurate, that your reporting is reliable. It's building pipelines, ensuring robustness. It's making sure that there is only one definition of an active user, and that active user counts are the same from one report to another. A lot of data engineering and analytics engineering work falls into this bucket, but analysts and data scientists also have their share of proficiency work. So it's focusing on ensuring you choose the best model for your type of problem. It's making sure that your work will scale with the organization. It's all of the investigation that your analysts do to make sure that they're really confident in their conclusions before they share it out with others. So as I describe these kinds of proficiency tasks, maybe it's obvious that these are super important. Without proficiency, you end up with data outages, incorrect data, and other snafus that erode user trust. On the other side, what I'm calling creative work throughout this talk is what makes data valuable to the company. Creative work leverages data in new and novel ways. It's when you turn data into insight and action. It's when you create new knowledge. You build new data products that solve a problem for your users. This side of the work is also incredibly important. An organization can have beautifully clean data. But if no one on the data team is partnering with other folks within the business to think about all the ways that data can be applied and all the ways that they can take action on that data, what they can learn about customers and how they can use it to target more effectively, how you can predict future behavior of customers, how you can bring to light a hidden inefficiency and ultimately solve it, then the organization isn't getting as much value out of the data team as it could. Also importantly, creative work is just fun. This is the work that gets your team fired up. Data is an incredible canvas, and you can do so many cool things. We're humans. We long for creative expression and the chance to bring something new into the world. If you don't give your team enough opportunities to do creative work, then you'll end up with bored, burned out team members. So both sides of this are incredibly important for making data valuable to your organization. So which comes first? Where do you start so you can grow into the other? In case you haven't caught on yet, I really like this metaphor of the balance to illustrate the concepts. Despite many Medium articles to the contrary arguing the opposite, I do not believe that data needs are a pyramid. This is not about building a base of rigor and adding on your insights and your predictive models that actually add value to the organization. I don't want to suggest that if you just work hard enough on that base of rigor, that someday in the faraway future, you'll reach this pinnacle of enlightenment and finally be able to throw these creative ideas into the world. Both proficiency and creativity have to be in balance from the very beginning. If you skip the proficiency work and go straight to creative work, if you're trying to pull insights out of your production data directly, you're going to run into roadblock after roadblock. It feels like the Wild West. It'll be hard to repeat your work when someone comes back in 6 months and asks you to refresh it. You'll have data chaos, you'll have broken pipelines, you'll have wrong data. This is the reason that the pyramid metaphor is popular. Without enough focus on proficiency, stakeholders get frustrated, they disengage because they can't trust the work coming out of the data team. That lack of trust makes it harder to be effective, because if your CEO doesn't trust the data to be right, why should they use it to make an important decision? You can make a gut decision quite a bit faster. So why waste the time to bring in the data team if what they bring in might not be correct? In a team without enough focus on proficiency, from the team member's perspective, everything feels like a fire drill. The team feels like they're taking orders, they're running into bugs, there are outages, and in many cases, the people on your team will tell you, I don't do anything strategic. I'm not using the skills that I want to use, because they're constantly reactive. They don't have enough time to be proactive. And without repeatable systems, your data monkey becomes your repeatable system. But on the other side, if you start with proficiency work and focus on the pipelines, it can take a really long time to create business value. This is a little bit less recognized, but this is also kind of what Emily Sherriot talked about yesterday. If you take it to an extreme, you can have a data warehouse that includes all the data you could ever want. It's beautiful, it's clean, it's well-modeled, it's organized. But if no one is taking that final step to create value from the data, then your stakeholders are getting frustrated and disengaging with your team because the work doesn't seem to connect to the outcomes they're focused on. Without that creative work, your team members will also feel siloed and disconnected. They may complain that they're building a lot of tools no one uses. Counterintuitively, they may have the exact same feedback about using their strategic skills as in the other world, because they aren't getting to connect their work to a meaningful organizational outcome. The key is to build a culture where both sides are consistently in balance. Invest in rigor, but see projects through, add in the creativity, and take the analysis to the point where it becomes actionable for the business. Now, overall, this challenge is somewhat new for data teams and is becoming more important because of the shift towards more modern data tools and more modern data team structures. Once upon a time, in what some might call the bad old days, data teams were separated, and creative tasks and proficiency tasks were often performed by completely separate teams. Data engineering got the data where it needed to be with a high level of accuracy, high level of reliability. Data analysts took the data and added value for the business. There was a hard break between the two. They nearly always reported into separate teams. And so you didn't have to talk about these trade-offs on a daily basis. Instead, you were more likely to have kind of annual headcount conversations. Are we investing the right amount, relatively speaking, into these two tasks? But as data tools have become more empowering and data teams have evolved accordingly, those lines have really become blurred. Today, often everyone on your team owns a piece of both. So it's increasingly important to build data team cultures that pointedly balance proficiency and creativity. So I just used the word culture, which can be a really fuzzy word, but it's ultimately a really important part of solving this challenge. The concept of creativity and proficiency-oriented cultures that inspired this talk originally comes from a book called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. And Coyle's basic argument is that culture is what enables a diverse group of people to rally together, solve a really hard problem, and achieve great things. And that companies that build cultures effectively are dramatically more successful than those that don't. Culture is how you can grow a team and keep it great. It's how great leaders scale themselves. And so there are different types of company cultures. Ford is very much a proficiency culture. They built a culture obsessively focused on repeatability and reliability. And they're really good at doing the same thing over and over with a high level of quality. When you're really sure you're building the right thing, you can lean way into proficiency. And your biggest focus is that you're building that thing quickly, flawlessly, efficiently. Repeatability is your differentiator. So within the company, you create rituals and norms that reinforce how critical it is. Pixar, on the other hand, is an example of a creativity-oriented culture. Pixar built their culture focused on ideation, thinking outside the box, and they are really good at doing new things constantly. When every project is a work of art, then over-indexing on creativity makes sense. If novelty is your differentiator, and then you build your culture to encourage it. You think about how the design of your office encourages serendipitous collisions that might spark new ideas. You focus on rituals and norms that create space for daydreams and innovation. Where I break with Coyle is that he considers these two things mutually exclusive. You're good at proficiency, or you're good at creativity. You identify what type of company you want to be, and you build the culture that leans very hard into that side. But I think a modern data team has to be good at both, all the time. The data has to be reliable, but you have to constantly be thinking about new applications of the data that can drive value for the company. Within our data team, and often within our organizations as a whole, we aren't sure we're building the right thing. We need to be flexible and creative to meet our organization's needs. But at the same time, our projects are not works of art. If my colleague has already defined active users, there is zero value in me rethinking that for my analysis. For data teams, there's value in both novel solutions and repeatable implementations. And culture matters because the team is making decisions about these trade-offs constantly. What should I work on next? Should I add a day to this project so I can refactor this gnarly DBT model so we can move faster next time? Should I just send the data this person asked for? Or should I spend the time to really think through what problem they're solving and come up with the right solution for that? When is this analysis ready to share? When am I confident enough in my conclusions? In those situations, they're either going to ask their manager constantly for feedback on which is which, or more likely, they're going to take cues from the culture of your team to decide what to do. So to build the culture that you want, as a leader, you initially have to be the lighthouse, and you have to take a lot of concrete action to help build this culture. But over time, it becomes self-reinforcing, and the whole team ultimately takes ownership of maintaining this balance between creativity and proficiency. Once it's baked into the culture, it's no longer your daily job to be the one to negotiate the balance for each member of your team. Everyone is thinking through trade-offs whenever it's necessary. So let's talk a little bit more about how to build each side of that culture that we ultimately want to keep in balance. So how do you build a culture that encourages proficiency, that prioritizes rigor and quality? It starts with bringing some basic engineering practices into your team. These are the ideas that heralded the rise of analytics engineering as a discipline. Things like testing and monitoring, code review, other peer review opportunities, thinking about scalability, reusability, and maintenance in everything that you build. If you didn't hear Kelly Burdine's talk yesterday, I highly recommend her point of view on how to bring it into your organization. Some of these ideas will be new to people on your team. Analysts, some data scientists haven't always been responsible for thinking about scalability. But as they integrate it into their work, they'll start to see how they can prevent messes for themselves, how they can make it easier for other people to build on top of their work in the future. Various types of peer review, whether that's code review, reviewing designs, sort of early plans of how someone wants to solve a problem, reviewing analyses together, helps the team up-level each other's skills so that it starts to be a more natural part of how people work. It also has to be very clear that everyone on the team owns this work. It does not belong to data engineers and analytics engineers. They may have a particular role in making sure you've got the tools and the norms to support it, but this kind of work is important for everyone to do. As a leader, you have to explicitly assign value to this work. It should be explicitly called out in career ladders. It should be necessary for advancement in all roles. It might look different in different roles, but everyone needs to be focused on it. And you should be celebrating new ideas or new processes, new ways to resolve common issues loudly and proudly. Talk about data testing in your company all hands, even if 90% of the people in there don't understand it. When you publicly celebrate people for doing this work, it takes work that can be invisible and shows how much you value it. And finally, you might think about introducing user trust as a key metric for your data team. You can literally just send out a survey, ask people, do you trust our data? And hold your team accountable to improving that number over time or keeping it high. There we go. And then how do you build a culture of creativity? Encouraging people to constantly find new ways for data to drive value within the business. The first and most important step is empowering your team. Provide the support and the tools that folks need and trust them to follow their instincts. A team that's primarily reactive, they're doing work that they were asked to do, they're probably getting a lot done. They're churning through tickets. But if they don't feel that their leaders or their stakeholders trust them to go down the right rabbit holes or to proactively design new solutions to a problem, they're missing opportunities for the company to exploit their serendipitous discoveries and their creative ideas. You need to help your team generate and celebrate new ideas, even when not all of them are good. Make space for sharing ideas, brainstorming sessions, casual discussions where ideas get hashed out. As a leader, be really careful what you add to these sessions, because you can easily tamp down the creativity. The more you encourage people to speak up without being there to say, oh, that's not a priority, or that's going to be hard because of this, the more and better ideas you'll get over time. It takes a high level of psychological safety and a high degree of mutual respect on your team for this to work. So it can take time for these discussions to start to get really fruitful. But over time, you'll start to kind of build these muscles within the team and see a lot of great results. Getting your team close to your users can spark so many wonderful ideas. Ensure your team isn't working in a silo, separated from the people who actually use the data products, or even your company's product end users. The more that your team can build context about how folks use their work to make decisions, what decisions are most important, what does the strategy look like across other teams, the more they can generate ideas that will make life easier for their stakeholders, or answer questions that people don't even know how to ask yet. You can cross-pollinate by getting your team into regular stakeholder meetings, get folks to join the weekly sales meeting, or have someone from the sales team come in and talk to your team about what are the challenges you're facing, what's hard right now, and what's going well. The more connections you help your team build within the organization, the more connections they're building within their brain that ultimately will improve the quality of the ideas that they're coming up with. Creative work takes time, and your job as a leader to make sure your team has that time. But unfortunately, time is not infinite. And so using time-boxed explorations can be a really effective way to help people explore an idea without wasting time, without churning, without getting stuck in some sort of rabbit hole. And so, for example, if someone has a great idea or an interesting idea, you can say, great, let's set a deadline for this. In 2 days, we're going to check in, and you're going to tell me one of 3 things. Either, I'm done, that was great, I have this really interesting thing to share. I'm done, it actually didn't really turn out well. There's not a lot to go from. Or, I'm not done, but this is really interesting, and I think there's a thread worth pulling on here. So let's figure out when we can prioritize more time to dig into this big, meaty exploration. And finally, you have to teach your team how to embrace failure. It's important to do work that we know will pay off. But it's also important to explore things when we don't know if it will pay off. When you make that exploration, you're going to run into failure. You need to make it clear to the data team and to your organization as a whole that you still learn a lot from projects that don't achieve their initial objective. Knowledge is valuable, even when the knowledge is that this wasn't a great idea. You can institute sort of celebratory failure documents or ways to, instead of just share exciting results, bring people together to talk through what you learned from your failure. The company grows as much from what didn't work and why as it does from what succeeded, but we often aren't great at treating it that way. There we go. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there is also some mental stretching involved to embrace the dualities of this balance. A lot of times the people on our team will want a right answer. They'll want to know, when in doubt, always prioritize this. But when we're intentionally creating a balance between two polarities, we have to allow some tension to exist. As a leader, it really helps to acknowledge and own the times when it appears that there's a conflict between proficiency and creativity, and help your team get comfortable that both can coexist. The first way that this manifests itself is that reliability seems like it's at odds with celebrating failure. But your culture can absolutely celebrate both. The important thing here is to acknowledge the difference between predictable and unpredictable failures. Proficiency work, things that are intended to increase reliability, testing, peer review, focusing on rigor, those are meant to protect us from predictable failures. We should embrace and celebrate the work that goes into that, while also acknowledging they'll happen sometimes. You'll get those bugs, you'll get those outages. What you want to do is always improve for the future. But creative work results in unpredictable failures. When you go into a project that has never been explored, you don't know whether it will work or not. That's okay. It's good. Failure in a creative project is really just learning something new. So acknowledging those failures, sharing what you learned, it wasn't what you expected, is a way to start to balance across these two. The other challenging balance is that there are no bad ideas, but at the same time, all of our organizations have limited resources, so not every idea is going somewhere. Encourage your team to share ideas early and often, but you can't sink your resources into every idea. One thing that helps here is really starting to build a culture of feedback and critique. It's important for people to understand that critiques are an opportunity to learn, to improve, to make their work better. It's not negative feedback. And as the team becomes more comfortable critiquing each other kindly and accepting critiques gracefully, it will help you identify dead ends and future surprises sooner and help the team understand why certain projects are prioritized and others are not. All right, so I always like to have the takeaway slide, the one you take a picture of, share with your team, say, look, I really went to this conference, here's the actionable takeaway. But I like this as a nudge to think, what does your team need more of to build a healthier balance? Do they need more rituals designed to foster creativity? Do they need more chances to brainstorm ideas? Do you need to implement time boxes on these creative rabbit holes people run down? Do you need to find ways to celebrate failure visibly and across the organization? Do you need to just bring people closer to your users? Or do you need more rituals designed to bolster your proficiency? Do you need to improve your testing and monitoring? Do you need to find more review mechanisms? Do you need to make sure that that proficiency work is actually valued and actually helps people get promoted? Do you need to understand better from your users where you stand on this? And this isn't either or, you might need both. You might need one or another. But it's nice to think about this as bite-sized chunks and things that you can take one step at a time to move closer to the balance that you're looking for. And I'm not going to pretend that it's easy. There's a lot that's hard about this. It's hard to figure out the right balance for a specific organization at a specific time with a specific team. It's hard to get your team comfortable that they'll never have a strong answer one way or another. I've led a couple of different teams through distinct phases of company and team development, and I can tell you this is a constant negotiation between competing priorities. It's dynamic, it's consistently challenging to get it right. But I have found this framework to be a helpful way to think through those trade-offs and to communicate those trade-offs, both within your team and within the broader organization. But when you get the balance right, it feels like magic. Those super smart people that you hired are operating at an incredibly high level. They feel like they spend their time where it is adding the most value, whether that's shoring up a data mart or presenting an analysis to a strategic partner that ultimately grows the business. They have the context they need to be effective. They have space to be creative. But they also have the scaffolding they need to work quickly, reliably, and repeatably. Your data team members are engaged. The organization sees the value of the data team as a strategic partner, and it is just like one big chart with upward trend emoji. So that's where I'm going to wrap up, with this beautiful vision of your team's future. Oh, that went off. All right. Thanks so much for your time today. There's a blog post on Locally Optimistic that goes through this in more detail if you're interested. I recommend checking out the Culture Code if you're interested more generally in sort of building company cultures. And I also want to give a special shout out to Locally Optimistic's amazing illustrator, Margarita Fomenko, for making this deck beautiful. So all the links plus the slides can be found at the QR code. And we've got some time left, so I'm happy to take questions, feedback, whatever's coming into Slido.
Yay, thank you so much. Yes, we have questions, and I agree with the very first one. Excellent illustrations, absolutely wonderful. Wow, I was about to ask. Great. No, we do have some questions, indeed. In my team, we have enough time for creativity, but often the results of this are not used by business users, and we work for the drawer. That's a widespread thing. What would you suggest?
So I think in those situations, it's really that connection to the business that's important, because it can be really challenging to not have alignment around strategic priorities. So if the sales team is very focused on enterprise sales, and your team decides that they could build a super effective model for consumer sales opportunities, that's just it's not a great match. And so it's very likely that that isn't going to get used. But the more that your team gets embedded with various teams, understands the context, understands company strategy overall, the more effective they'll be at not just identifying something that is cool and interesting and an opportunity to use a new framework or a new tool that they just learned about, but that it is something that is actually connected to a key business outcome that really matters for the company.
All right, thank you. What is creativity in data engineering? Because it's mostly technical job.
I think it can take a lot of different forms. It's often figuring out what the problem is. So people come to data engineering with solutions a lot of times, and they say, I need you to do this exact thing for me, or I need you to kind of run through this existing playbook. I think a lot of the creativity in data engineering is thinking about what could be. What are the frameworks we should be adopting? What are the tools we should be adopting? What could I build that makes life easier for a lot of people within the organization? And so, again, it's getting out of that reactive mode of dealing with the problem in front of you today and thinking more about what could this look like? What's the dream state for data engineering with us?
All right. What would you say as a rule of thumb, how much of the analyst's time should be spent for creativity versus BAU?
So I'm guessing BAU stands for business as usual here. But I think that depends a lot on the organization, on the team, how big the team is, kind of what state of maturity your infrastructure is in. Because as much as I don't think that it's purely a pyramid, there is proficiency work that you need to do first, and kind of it's all a negotiation. And so it's hard for me to give you a right answer. But what I do find helpful is to think through how much time you could set aside for that. Is it a day a week? Is it a morning a week? Is it a day a month. It might be more or less, but to create that time and kind of protect it, I think can be really helpful. And you can test different sort of iterations of that and see if it were 1 day a week, can you still keep up with what needs to be done? What would have to drop off the roadmap? What are kind of the trade-offs you're making there?
All right, thank you very much. I think that answers also the question about the creativity. Can you share examples of failures that you celebrated with your team?
Yeah, so I think a lot of these have been around big, audacious efforts that just didn't work. And so it's like, can we predict something that's critical for this business? And sometimes yes, sometimes you can predict something with really solid accuracy and make a huge difference, and sometimes you can spend a pretty decent amount of time trying to build a model to predict something, and it just doesn't work. You just don't have the data to do it. And so one example is that I worked for a large crowdfunding platform. And in crowdfunding, the biggest challenge is that creators come to the platform, they come with the best intentions. They want to bring something new into the world. But entrepreneurship is really hard. And it's really hard to create a new product. And so they'll come and they'll raise $1 million. People really are excited about their idea, and they just can't do it, and they never deliver, and no one ever gets the product that they hoped they were supporting the creation of. And so understanding risk in those projects is a huge challenge. And so, there was a project that my team worked on to try to project whether a campaign was higher risk or lower risk, kind of how much can we give visibility to the backers to understand what they're getting into. And the answer was like, it is a coin flip. We have no idea. With the information that we have when someone starts a campaign, we have no idea if they're going to be successful. And so that's a situation where sort of we celebrated that we put the effort into it, that we really tried, that we weren't able to do it, and then we started to think about what other information could we capture, or what other tools could we provide these creators to increase their likelihood of success, and like what are the other ways we can tackle this problem?
All right, thank you. Do we agree that we can skip the next one? Because we just talked about the creativity and data. How to convince the CEO to build a data culture in the company?
Ultimately, your CEO cares about making the business successful. And so the most effective way to help build the case for a data-driven culture is to show how data connects to success in the way that the CEO defines success. And so that's some combination of revenue growth, expense efficiency, or strategic value, like alignment with company strategy. And so I think this is a place where you want to think through iteratively, what are small projects you can undertake that are aligned with one of those high-level company goals, where you can actually drive value? How can you partner with the marketing team to improve the efficiency of the marketing spend? How can you work with the growth team to identify how you can improve the fruits of your outreach? But really taking specific projects that are very closely tied to business outcomes and seeing them to the end is really key. And I think Emily Sherrio used the phrase toll paying yesterday, like building reporting is paying tolls. And so, yes, your CEO will want to look at reports. You have to kind of pay that toll, but you have to build a balance where you make time for something that actually drives value and shows what your team can do so that you can start to get more buy-in on working this way generally.
Thank you. That was a repeating pattern indeed in several talks that show why is it profitable, why is it good, and do the MVP. Thank you. You mentioned tools and rituals to obtain balance. In your experience, which methods were the most effective to reach the proficiency and creativity balance?
So again, I think it really depends on the company, the team, the stage of development. There's a lot of variables in there, but often you have to identify sort of where your gap is. Is your team too focused on building the things? They just want to like go in their silo and build really amazing data marts and hand them off to an invisible customer? Are they very kind of proficiency oriented? Or do they tend to want to spend too much time going down rabbit holes and exploring things that maybe aren't connected to those business goals? And taking whichever one is the dominant side and finding ways to bring in the other can be really helpful. So if you're too far on the proficiency side, finding opportunities to have a hack week, or just bring some brainstorming into your team meetings. Just sit and say, like, look, here's a problem the company has. How could we contribute to this? What are the ways that the data team could help impact this big company goal? Those can be really effective. If you're too far on the creativity side, then the very first thing is time boxing. It's so effective. When you have an analyst who loves to go down rabbit holes or loves to investigate things that are not always actually connected to business value, teaching them how to do that within a boundary can be really helpful and give you more opportunities to check in and say, okay, we put a one-day time box on this. How did it go? What did you learn? And you can start to teach them a little bit more about how to connect it to strategy.
All right, thank you very much. You've mastered all the questions. Yay. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being an amazing speaker. Look at this. Beautiful. Oh, my God. Thank you so much. Let's give a warm hand to Kate. Right. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Thank you so much.